Hey everybody, I hope that you had a fantastic winter break. I just want to quickly review some of the important events of early Ohio, and even a little bit before Ohio became a state. And we're going to start by just reviewing the American Revolution. So, if you remember, the United States was once a colony of Great Britain, which meant that Great Britain, who was controlled at the time by King George, Great Britain controlled everything about the colonies. The way that they could set up their governments, what could be traded to different countries, what type of taxes were placed on them. Great Britain controlled the colonies. And in 1776, the colonists began to think of themselves not as British, but as Americans. And they wanted to govern themselves. They wanted to create their own government. And so on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. And the Declaration of Independence was a document written by Thomas Jefferson that said that the colonists are going to free themselves from the British rule and become their own independent country. And what led to the colonists wanting independence from Great Britain was two things, right? We talked about them earlier. The Proclamation of 1763, where King George told the colonists that they were not allowed to travel west of the Appalachian Mountains to live. The Proclamation of 1763. The second reason the colonists wanted independence was that there was high taxation. There were a lot of taxes being placed on the colonists so that Great Britain could pay off their debt. And so you had taxes on paper and newspapers and playing cards. You had taxes on lead and paint and glass and tea. Remember, tea was the most popular drink in the colonists. So these high taxes, plus they didn't have representation in the British government. They didn't have a say. They couldn't fight these taxes. Remember the rallying cry, no taxation without representation. No taxes without representation in the British government is what the colonists wanted. And when they couldn't get it, they declared independence. So from 1776 to 1783, the colonists were in battle with the British. And this is known as the American Revolution. In 1783, the colonists won. They became their own independent country known as the United States of America. But not only did the colonists win their independence, they gained a lot of land from their victory. The red area were the original 13 colonies where the colonists lived. The orange is what the colonists, or now the Americans, gained from their victory. And so they gained the land. This is the Appalachian Mountains. So the Appalachian Mountains, west of the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. So Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, this land that was once controlled by Great Britain was now in control by the United States. So this land, especially Ohio, or what becomes Ohio, became very populated. A lot of people were moving west now that they could. They weren't controlled by the king any longer. They could move into this new land. So they were moving. And the United States government had to set up a plan to admit states from the Northwest Territory into the United States. So they had to set up a plan of how are we going to make states out of this land, this territory. And so they passed what became known as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And what the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 stated, and remember, ordinance means law. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, first off, stated that this is known as the Northwest Territory. This land, the Northwest Territory. And this land, using this land, 3 to 5 states should be created out of the Northwest Territory. So 3 to 5 states should be created out of this land. And the Northwest Ordinance set up steps to statehood. How can a piece of this territory, an area in this territory, become a state? So step 1, Congress selected the territory's leaders. So Congress, the people in charge of making laws for the United States, Congress selected the territory's leaders. So who was going to be in charge of the Northwest Territory? So they picked a governor, they picked a secretary, and they picked 3 judges. And they were in charge of creating a legal code, dealing with Native Americans, and so on. Step 2 is once 5,000 white men lived in the territory, they could elect their own lawmakers. So they could elect their own people to make the laws once 5,000 men lived in the area. And step 3, so again, we're moving to statehood. Step 3 is once 60,000 people lived in the territory, they could apply for statehood. So once 60,000 people moved into what is now Ohio, they could apply for statehood. During this 3rd step, the people living in the area had to create a state constitution as well. Remember, a constitution is a plan of government. So not only did 60,000 people have to live in the area, but they had to create a plan of government, a constitution as well. And once they did these 2 things, they could apply to become a state. They'd have to be approved by Congress and the President of the United States, which at this time was Thomas Jefferson. Also, according to the Northwest Ordinance, there were certain rights and freedoms that were guaranteed in the Northwest Territory. So freedom of religion. So when Ohio becomes a state, there has to be freedom of religion. There has to be the right to a trial by jury. They encouraged public education by building schools in the area. They talked about fair treatment of Native Americans, that they should be treated fairly and properly. And instead of taking land, you pay for the land. And the last one that it did, and this is the focal point of this week's lesson, is the Northwest Ordinance. All the land in the Northwest Territory prohibited slavery, which means slavery was not allowed in the Northwest Territory at all. So all of these were guaranteed in the Northwest Ordinance. So, in this area, the Northwest Ordinance. So when Ohio gets the 60,000 people, creates its own constitution with these 5 guarantees in it, it applied for statehood and became a state. So on March 1st, 1803, Ohio became the 17th state in the United States. Now, if you remember what I just mentioned, Ohio is a free state. When it becomes a state, it is a free state. It is a non-slave state. That's what it means by free state. There is no slavery in Ohio. Ohio is one of the non-slave states. So what happens from 1803 to 1853? There becomes this divide. The northern states, which includes Ohio, are non-slave states, and the southern states are slave states. Remember, the southern states, as we talked about before break, the southern states, they do a lot of agriculture, which is a lot of farming. They have big plantations. They use enslaved people for free labor. They were slave focused. The North was not. They were non-slave states. Ohio was one of them. So this week we are going to talk about how Ohio played an important role in the freeing of enslaved people, helping enslaved people to their freedom. We're going to talk about the abolitionist movement in Ohio, which is, again, the freeing of enslaved people. We're going to talk about the Underground Railroad, which actually wasn't a railroad, a choo-choo railroad, but it was a way to help enslaved people escape to their freedom in Canada. And then we're going to talk about the next big war in the United States, known as the Civil War. And the Civil War is the North states, the non-slave states, versus the southern states, the slave states, and they're going to fight. The North wants to end slavery, the South wants to keep slavery, and we'll mention Abraham Lincoln as well. So here's a quick review. Now let's start our lesson on slavery and the Underground Railroad in Ohio.